probably the clicker for the, yeah, that could be. All right. He's coming, yeah. I kick it off? I just start? Okay. You gonna talk from the podium? So yours will follow him, and so just the clicker, right click, left click, and this is the laser here.
So how's it going to go?
So well, good morning. Welcome back. We had a great day yesterday, and I expect that we will have a full day today of great presentations and discussion. We're going to kick this off this morning looking at what many people call the hard targets. We're going to look at the Special Operations Forces of North Korea, of Russia, and of China. And we have three distinguished experts on these areas here. And I'd just like to caveat a couple points here that we're going to look at these Special Operations Forces, but I think it's important not to mirror image, not to compare them directly to U.S. or South Korean or any allied special operations. We should think about whether they are 10 feet tall or not. I don't think the North Koreans are 10 feet tall. They're pretty small. But we tend to look at our adversary special operations forces as larger than life. So we really need to try to understand their real capabilities. And we don't expect that we'll be fighting allied SOF versus our adversary SOF. A lot of people ask me that question. They say, well, doesn't it take a gorilla to find a gorilla? But the Special Operations Force, one thing in common is that they are looking for targets that are vulnerable, that are strategic, and it is unlikely that we're going to be directly, deliberately encountering each other. The vulnerable people and the vulnerable targets are not protected by military forces, maybe, or certainly not protected by SOF, and populations are vulnerable, and so these special operations forces are really they're dangerous, and it's important that we know them. And so we're going to look at these three. Now, we heard yesterday, know yourself and know your enemy. I think it was in Jeff's slides, one of Jeff's slides yesterday. And that is true. We have to know ourselves, we have to know our enemy, and 100 battles will be victorious. I'm also a proponent of Frank Hoffman, really the father of asymmetric warfare. He argues that we should have a principle of understanding and a principle of war. And, it does seem like a no-brainer because Sun Tzu did teach us to know ourselves and know our enemy. But we really have to have a deeper understanding of war, of warfare, the conditions that give rise to conflict, and the politics that lead to and end conflict. And so it's not just a question of knowing our enemy or knowing ourselves. It is really about understanding. But the need for understanding would seem to be so obvious that we think we do not even need to mention it. But in fact, I would argue that many of our failures, particularly in the last 2 decades, might be connected to our lack of understanding of the strategic environment, the operational environment, and the political environment. So understanding is I think, an important concept. And I hope today we'll be able to gain some understanding about these forces. First, we've got Lieutenant General In Chun, who is the commander of the South Korean Special Forces, and he's going to kick this off. Then we're going to have Dmitry Belikov, who is a photojournalist, and I think he has an advantage because a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think he'll share some photos with us. He's going to talk about his experiences with the Russian Spetsnaz. And then Lyle Goldstein, who is an expert on China, on the PLA, in many areas there, and so he's going to talk about the PLA SOF there. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to General Chun. And then, of course, we'll have Q&A following.
Good morning, everyone. Bum Chun. I'm from the Republic of Korea. Today's subject is Know Your Enemy, the future of global competition. But I would be remiss as a Korean to take this opportunity to thank all of the American people here for helping us Koreans. Please visit my country and see what you have been able to do with your support. I thank all of you as a Korean to all of the Americans here. So, in order to approach this subject, I've labeled my title An Introduction to the Asian Way of Special Operations, and they gave me 6 minutes, and I've just used up 30 seconds, so we don't have much time. So let's all start at the same definition. So the definition of special operations: specially designed, organized, selected, trained, and equipped forces using unconventional techniques and modes of employment. I hope we can all agree on that. Well, actually, that was a definition of these guys. So thousands of years ago, even before this definition, we had these guys to deal with, and they were called ninjas, not the turtle ones, the real ones. And this is how you spell ninja in the traditional Chinese character. And what it means is the patient ones. So it says a lot about the thinking that goes on. A lot of planning, knowing your enemy, knowing yourself, training, and using all kinds of techniques, as we've seen in movies and novels and whatever, But what about the Chinese? Well, we really don't know. It's such a secretive organization that nobody really knows. There's some comic books out there, but I don't think we should rely on comic books. The only thing that we do know is that they have them. Now, initially, I was under the impression that I was going to have a 90-minute time to lecture on this subject, but then I realized it was only 6 minutes, so I cut a lot out. But the North Koreans have their own version of special forces, and it comes from a great deal of experience during the Great Wars during World War II, so we won't be able to talk about that. So going to China, and of course, Lyle's going to talk more about that. So we all know about the art of war. It was written on some bamboo sticks. It comes from 700 years of warfare in the continent. Can you imagine 700 years of fighting? And so this guy named Sun Tzu, wrote this book, and The Art of War is an ancient Chinese military treatise dating from the 5th century. The work is, of course, attributed to Sun Tzu and is composed of 13 chapters. Each one is devoted to a different set of skills of art related to warfare and how it applies to military strategy and tactics. And because it is written in Chinese, unless you have a perfect understanding of each Chinese character, how it was written, why it was written, you really won't be able to grasp the full understanding of or the meaning of the art of war. So we fall into a mistake of reading something and thinking, we understand it only as part of our own experience, and that's a danger that we must always be aware of. The second literature is this thing. The 36 stratagems. I think this is lesser known, but the 36 stratagems is a Chinese essay used to illustrate a series of stratagems used in politics, war, and civil interaction. Its focus is on the use of cunning and deception, both on the battlefield and in court. Not in a legal court, but where the emperors and the eunuchs used to be, and the princesses. A lot of political, angling to survive in that kind of environment. So imagine somebody actually wrote about this. And finally, we have this, unrestricted warfare. This might be more familiar for you because it was translated into English as well. The full title is Unrestricted Warfare, 2 Air Force Senior Colonels on Scenarios for War and the Operational Art in an Era of Globalization. This is a book on military strategy written in 1999 by 2 colonels, Kyoryang and Wang Sang-soo. Its primary concern is how a nation such as China can defeat a technologically superior opponent like the United States with a variety of means. Rather than focusing on direct military confrontation, this book instead examines a variety of other means, such as political warfare or legal tools, which they term lawfare, and economic means as leverage over one's opponent to circumvent the need for direct military action. And this is the area where I am really concerned, because even now, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans have access to not only an open society like the United States, but to Korea as well. So what does this all mean? Well, all those black and white World War II movies where the slanty-eyed Japanese fool the American Marines and betray the truce and everything. Well, it's true. The Asians are cunning because they believe in this: all is fair in love and war. So lying, treachery, betrayal, cheating, to the Asian mind, that's how wars should be fought. When you guys come up with rules and regulations, morals. I mean, even the use of using words, morals in war is, I'm sorry to say this, but stupid and something to be exploited from their point of view. And they can do these things. They can conduct one-way missions. We South Koreans are now spoiled like you Americans. I cannot tell my soldiers to go on a mission which will result in certain death. I used to be able to do that, but now I can't. They need at least a 50% chance of coming back. But it's still a very low number. But to the other guys, they can do one-way missions. We saw this a couple of days ago. Those guys on paragliders. Do you think they were thinking about coming back? No. But they were able to do that. They can endure extreme pain and hardship. I mean, something that you cannot even imagine. And cruelty. Extreme cruelty. Have you noticed in the Hollywood movies, there's a lot of movies about the European conflict, but very few in the Pacific? Now, very few movies. Why do you think that is? In Okinawa, it drove the Marines, U.S. Marines, crazy the way the Japanese fought. Don't ever, this is an advice from a Korean, feel guilty about dropping those 2 atomic bombs. You did the Japanese people a favor. You did all of us a favor. And to the Asian mind, it's about winning the hearts and minds. And this is where I think Americans are really bad at doing. So when I was deploying to Iraq, I was a colonel in 2004. My four-star general, he didn't like the fact that I had a lot of American friends like Dave Maxwell here. And he said, Colonel Chun, do you know the difference between an American and a Korean? It was a rhetorical question, so I kept silent. And he said, an American will throw an MRE to an Iraqi, but a Korean will give an MRE with both hands. You know, I didn't like the guy, but he had a point. Americans have a culture of such a casual culture. You know, anybody can come up to you and say hello. We Koreans don't do that. You know? You have a very casual culture, but in many other cultures, that casualness is thought to be rude and condescending. So beware, my American friends. Unbeknownst to you, your casual nature could be offensive to a lot of other people. Since I only have 6 minutes, I'm going to end with this. This is what your Assistant Secretary of State said in 1968. And I part with this thought for you. White men can't win this kind of fight. I hope we'll be able to win the next one. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do I click? In my journalistic past, I spent a good deal of time with the different Russian Spetsnaz units, and I was invited to discuss how the US Special Operations Forces could counter future engagement with their Russian counterparts should the need arise. It should be noted that at present the probability of hypothetical open clash between the Russian Spetsnaz and any foreign special force, including the American one, has significantly increased because all three kinds of Russian Spetsnaz, including Maroon Berets, which is Rosgvardia Special Force interior troop, are actively working beyond the Russian borders, mainly in Ukraine. And despite that, the constitution and laws of Russia do not allow the use of any interior troop outside of Russian borders. And such extraterritorial activity has been justified with the Kremlin propaganda slogan of protecting the Russian world. Apart from Maroon Berets, both the Russian Defense Ministry, GRU Special Reconnaissance Units, and the FSB Anti-Terror Squads A and V, they are actively working in the Ukraine. And it should be admitted that over the past 20 months of the war, various groups of Russian Spetsnaz demonstrated quite impressive results. Two recent examples: the demolition in September of a vehicular bridge across the river Sudast in the Sumy region, and the Russian snipers pair benchmark work. They were armed with the newest samples of ultra-long-range Lobayev arms rifles, and they were covering the actions of Spetsnaz group, which took out a Ukrainian stronghold in the Krasny Liman region. But one way or the other, at the moment, all Russian elite Spetsnaz units are conducting criminal orders of Commander-in-Chief Vladimir Putin and taking part in outrageously evil and unjust war. All three kinds of Russian Spetsnaz, once candidates are selected, the state allows from 12 to 18 months for training. Without exaggeration, in Russia there is a cult of Spetsnaz, and there are a lot of motivated men willing to take risks. However, it is extremely hard to qualify for any Russian Special Forces unit. And one must be prepared for extraordinary physical strains, years of hardships, low pay, and a job that can cripple or kill you. Both variants can expect you already in training or tests. This is especially the case with the Spetsnaz Rosgvardia, the Maroon Berets, where everyone who wants to belong to the elite must pass the exam for the right to wear the Maroon Beret. The qualification test includes an exhausting course of 7.5 miles in full combat gear with at least 3 water hazards. Then one must pass through the fire and assault strip, then performing acrobatic exercises, hand-to-hand combat with and without weapon, and on top of this, there is a 12-minute full contact spar with 3 fresh instructors. In the 30 years of the qualification tests, there were at least 10 deaths of volunteers who tried to pass. One of the highest advantages of the Russian Spetsnaz training program is that each soldier is trained so that he is capable of acting not only within a team, but also alone, representing a full-fledged combat unit. Each member of the team is expected to demonstrate independent survival and combat skills. But despite the development of self-reliance, one of the drawbacks is that in the Russian Special Forces, as in the entire Russian army, soldiers are almost deprived of the opportunity to show initiative. Orders are almost never explained or discussed. And I know of so many examples when idiotic orders from higher-ranking personnel, they forced the elite Spetsnaz to be used as regular assault battalions for primitive offensive reconnaissance, and they suffered huge losses and could not perform the task. I just give one example. In August 29, 1999, 2 combined groups of Maroon Berets, they received an order to take control of the commanding heights in the Buynaksk area of Dagestan, in Republic of Dagestan. There were huge problems with domestic insurgency there at that time. So they were told that on that mountain there was a radio transponder of the Wahhabis, and there was a stronghold of militants. No one of the generals assigned to the task could explain to the chief of staff of that special force why the goddamn transponder could not be destroyed by an airstrike. Commanders had to go on a raid, but during the performance of the task they discovered the height was not commanding at all. And from there the militants successfully fired mortars and automatic grenade launchers. The Russian groups were trapped. When they asked for evacuation, they were refused and ordered not to panic and hold positions at any cost. Spetsnaz followed orders. They were fighting for 11 hours. 5 special soldiers were killed. Almost 46 were wounded. Apart from that, during a night march, another soldier fell into an abyss and was badly mutilated. So, such an example confirms that known fact that Russian commanders, they do not think of how to protect their soldiers, how to reduce casualties. They're more concerned with meeting the deadlines of the operation. As for the fate of the civilian population, that is their last concern and no concern at all. Separately, worth noting is the notorious tendency of a lot of soldiers in the Russian Special Forces to sadism. And this is particularly true for Maroon Berets. Since 2000, as a journalist, I used to interview a lot of people who were victims of police and military violence and were subjected to sadistic tortures. One of the most memorable interviews for me was an interview with a school teacher in Chechnya, Alavdi Sadikov, who was kidnapped in Grozny on March 5 of 2000 by the fighters of the Russian OMON, which is riot police, but some of them belonged to the Maroon Berets tribe. So for 2.5 months, they were holding him in inhuman conditions and tortured him, forcing him to confess that he was Amir of Jamaat, a leader of an Islamist cell. That was not true. But they pierced his palm with an iron hot rod, burned his face with cigarettes, cut him with a knife, and forced him to eat his own hair. One of the henchmen, Major Degtyaryov, after playing football, an hour of severe beating, cut off Sadikov's ear with a knife. In 2009, I interviewed an officer of the Russian Special Force unit who for 5 years was running so-called black operations, secretly tracking down, abducting, interrogating, and executing suspects, then disposing of their bodies. On conditions of anonymity, he confessed to me that in 2002, during the interrogation of a man suspected of masterminding roadside bombs, he drove a railroad spike into his skull with a hammer. Among other standard interrogations techniques, he mentioned electric shocks, fingernail pulling, and sodomizing with police batons. It was then also that I first learned about the practice of dispersion, the disposal of bodies with the help of TNT. So the body of an adult man would be placed in a deep trench on a 130-pound TNT mattress, and then dispersed with checkers detonated. And this practice was so widespread that according to leading human rights monitoring group Memorial, which was awarded recently the Nobel Peace Award in 2022, during the Second Chechen War alone, just in Chechnya, 5,500 people went missing. I would not advise anyone to surrender to the Russian Special Forces, especially those Maroon Berets. Even if you are die-hard, you're not going to be encouraged or respected for your courage, just overwhelming pain and relentless humiliation. So if it turns out that US troops have to face the Russians on the battlefield, better make sure that you keep your last hand grenade for yourself. As unpleasant as it may seem, it is also necessary to recognize the propensity of many Russian military to looting and primitive corruption. Spetsnaz soldiers are no exception. It is not a matter of low-level discipline. It's a culture. It's a consequence of the long process of ideological mutation of many generations of Soviet people who were collectively accustomed to disrespect to private property. We have heard a lot about the barbaric behavior of the Russian military in Ukraine, where they looted supermarkets, malls, and private houses. I myself witnessed how Russian soldiers on mopping up operations in Chechnya were taking away cars from civilians, stealing belongings from the houses, and extorting cash from drivers on roadblocks. I once had to pay a so-called fine penalty. Even my press card did not help. About tactics. In general, technical support, communications, technological efficiency lag behind that in the West. The Russians still do not have night vision devices competing with Western designs. Until recently, they had no tactical GPS navigation system or GPS repeater kits, target location and targeting system. Portable movement sensors are not there yet. Russian soldiers have historically used very crude and simple but reliable military equipment and weapons. The hardware works, doesn't fail. Users are not spoiled with comfort. The Spetsnaz are considered among the best combat unit when it comes to close combat. And they are well armed for that. The Spetsnaz have no shortage of modern weaponry. And in some ways, Russian weapons designers have overtaken the West, including in regard to particular sniping systems. Today's deadliest sniper rifle, which has proven itself in the current Ukrainian conflict, was developed and manufactured in Russia, in Kaluga region. I'm talking about a rifle called SVLK-14S, Sumrak, which is for twilight, with an effective range of 1.4 miles. The accuracy and range of Sumrak rifle sounds almost unreal with such a powerful cartridge as the Chaitak 408, which a few people know how to shoot. Another outstanding sample is the DXL5 Havek, with average effective range up to 1.7 miles. It's a multi-modular rifle, which provides versatility of use by accommodating the ammunition at hand, be it a 50 BMG or Russian 50, different calibers with different parent cases. The irony is that the owner of Labayev Arms, the talented Russian armorer Vladislav Labayev, who alone created more than 10 different sniping weapons, studied weapons here in the United States, with the assistance of outstanding American armorers, Speedy Gonzalez, a noted shooter, gunsmith, and member of the Benchrest Hall of Fame, and also with Clay Spencer, former owner of Spencer Rifle Barrels Company. And Mr. Labayev interned with United States Marine. There is a Russian saying, slow harness, fast ride. It means that Russians traditionally are in no hurry to mobilize their forces, but they solve their problems very quickly, forcing the entire world into wonderment. Oh, these Russians tricked us again. You should have no illusions. Western sanctions do not work as you would like. Russia's economy is not on its knees. Russia's army is not defeated or even depressed by the fellas on the front. And there is simply no opposition to Putin. He has turned my country into ideological dump, where a normal, thoughtful person is not allowed and can't afford anything. And you can make money either working in a defense industry enterprise or killing Ukrainians on the front line or taking part in a propaganda circus. That's why anyone who wants normal life leaves Russia. Those who remain are forced to be members of Putin's sect. An aggressive totalitarian society is built with a hatred to the entire world, because normal Russian believes that Russia is a besieged fortress and NATO is looming and, crap like this. So the Russian population believes that country is not at war with Ukraine even. Actually, it is at war with the NATO bloc on the territory of Ukraine. And they believe that Ukraine desires to embrace Russia as an older brother. Russian soldiers are convinced that Russia has no right to lose the war, because if it is defeated, there will be no Russia as such. In such a scenario, hopeless scenario, we must prepare for a very long war, probably 5 to 10 years, in which special operation forces will play a crucial role. Thank you.
Special Operations Forces, and something very much worth keeping in mind. But the other characteristics you described certainly don't want to ever think that they could be applied to U.S. or allied SOF. Lyle, over to you.
Okay, yes. Good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be back in Norwich. And this is, I think, a very hard act to follow. Let me give it a shot, though. Well, when we talk about Chinese special forces, of course, immediately the Taiwan scenario comes to mind, and I think it is appropriate to think of it in that frame. I've been working myself a lot on thinking through what a Taiwan scenario would look like, and it is, I think, quite accurate to think that it could resemble a kind of D-Day type event. Indeed, this is a very detailed Chinese study of D-Day, and there are many of those. And believe me, they have fully grasped that a major aspect of D-Day, of course, was the use of special operations units to clear obstacles. There were hundreds of frogmen out there who were indeed the first to hit the beaches. I should say, though, as by way of a caveat, that there are many ways in which China can make use of special forces, of course, and some of that is even for counterterrorism and internal security, which is a very deep concern of the Chinese, as you know, especially out in the western provinces. On the Indian border, that border has extremely difficult terrain, as you probably know, so it also lends itself to special forces. And then, China has a lot of expanding roles across the developing world, for example, in Africa, and in places like that, there are, China certainly does envision possible use of special forces. But I'll focus in this talk, though, on how they might apply special forces in a Taiwan scenario. And here, you can see this kind of sniper training. Indeed, the main objective, I think, for Chinese special forces in that scenario would be to isolate, split up, and collapse the enemy. And Taiwan geography, I think, is quite amenable to that approach. And here you see, the kind of massive exercising, really that goes throughout the PLA, but with a focus on special forces for heliborne and airborne insertion. I'm somebody who watches Chinese military TV every day, and literally there's this kind of exercises going on that seems 24/7. I think, it's not it's not difficult to divine what the key targets for the Chinese special operations would be in these circumstances, whether taking out key radars and sensors, attacking headquarters, they would attack key junctions, bridges, of course, port facilities, airfields, and they would also be used to improve targeting, of course, tracking mobile forces. I wanted to highlight this article in particular, which is fascinating kind of first examination. It was published in June 2022 in a Chinese military magazine, where they looked really hard at the kind of opening operations of the Ukraine war and the activities of Russian special forces. And of course, they were quite critical. And what that article said was that the that the Russian Special Forces operation against Kiev, against, I think, Gostomel Airport there, was more or less a failure. Why? And they said this is an obvious Russian tactic. Everybody knew this was coming. It was a kind of scripted right out of the Kabul operation, that is when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. So, the Chinese conclusion is that it was a complete fail to do such an obvious tactic. So we can expect, I think, something quite different in the Taiwan scenario. Now, I have a Navy background, so I tend to focus on the naval component of Chinese Special Forces, and there, again, a lot going on. Let me highlight just a few items right away. I mean, you can see this, the importance of learning to break through the obstacles, use of kind of creative type, propulsion methods. Here you see that as well. And by the way, a little bit of evidence that, this has not been easy, but we also have some evidence of them training from getting special forces out of submarines, for example. This is an article that looks at how we do that. But one also a point I just wanted to emphasize here, and I think this shows, how pervasive the this kind of let's put it, this kind of seaborne attack has become in the Chinese armed forces. That these, this exercise here, for example, these are Chinese ground forces, special forces, also getting that. Diver training and preparing for the same sort of mission. So this is not a kind of training that's isolated to just sort of the Chinese equivalent of the SEALs, which they do have. Just as I close out, though, let me highlight one more dimension. I found this in reading Jiefan Junbao, the PLA Daily, back in September, but it was looking at how China is a major spacefaring power now. This is a mock-up of their space station today, but as a spacefaring power, this is going to give them a lot more options for communications. And believe me, they're watching, kind of Elon Musk's low orbit network and how that could support enhanced communications that would be important for targeting for special forces. But what I found remarkable about this article is right in the title. Here you have it mentioning that indeed that space and this kind of space superiority can really enhance special operations. So that I think is worth noting. And I'll just say, departing, I guess I'll return to D-Day and just say that that here's I picked this up off the Chinese military channel, but it was a kind of minute-by-minute discussion of the special operations preparations, in this case, the airborne attacks against that prepared the way for D-Day. So, I mean, it seems to me, if the PLA is studying these operations minute by minute, that just gives you a hint of preparations underway. So, anyway, thank you so much for having me, and happy to answer questions, across the board on China, though we're focusing on special operations today. Thank you.
Bob? All right, since we don't have much time, we're going to go right to Q&A. So if you please queue up to the microphones for your Q&A, and as you do that, we heard from General Chun really a really important view of the Asian mindset and a very candid description of that, something that I think is very important to understand. I think that the brutality of the Spetsnaz really comes out from Dmitri's. They are probably the most tested force that we will see as adversaries. And I think that Lyle made a point that we really should understand is how China will study us and everyone else to try to learn from. And so I think that's really important to, whatever we do, they are looking at and determining what they should adopt. So, question.
Good morning, gentlemen. My main question is, how important is Mao Zedong's writings on guerrilla warfare to the Chinese and North Korean special operations way of war?
Mao's writing on guerrilla warfare, is that applicable to North Korea or China?
Like I said, Sun Tzu's Art of War can be translated into many aspects, and it has lessons and teachings that can be applied to many, many generations. Having said that, we Koreans, North or South, don't particularly like the Chinese. So we'll take their advice, but we'll never say it publicly that we're taking their advice. It might be surprising to a lot of Americans, but the Koreans don't like the Chinese. And that goes for the North Koreans as well. This gives us a really good opportunity, though. When the North Koreans have been able to have 6 nuclear tests so far, when they had the first one, Kim Jong-il, the leader at that time, exclaimed, "Now we don't have to worry about the Chinese." He didn't say, "Now we don't have to worry about the Americans." So again, Sun Tzu is we South Koreans have a lot of translations of the book and all that, but it's from China.
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and I would just echo what the general said, that reading Sun Tzu, as we often say in English, is extremely important, and I urge anybody who hasn't looked at that. There is actually an excellent English translation by Samuel Griffith, and it really is, I would argue, the most important book in strategy. So if you haven't, but the question was about Mao Zedong's writings, and here I think that you're very correct that certainly in China it remains, a vital basis for how they think about war, and really you see a very clear tension, which really goes back to the beginning of the PLA, but it still exists today, between people who want to take the PLA in a kind of very high-tech direction, a very professional direction, and those who say that the PLA needs to remain, keep its kind of Maoist core, where it really is, everything is about people's war. And you see some of that in the Taiwan scenario, and I would argue even in the special operations context, there is some of that, whether to, how much to infuse their force with all this high-tech gadgetry. And there, an obvious question, I'm sure it came up yesterday, I do apologize for missing yesterday, but the attention between, is this a mission for drones, or is it a mission for special operators, or both? So I think that tension will be out there. But I do want to emphasize that throughout, a key part of their ideology, and indeed the military ideology, is that the human aspect of warfare trumps technology every time, and they will stand on that point, and really that is one reason why I think that they think that they can prevail in the Taiwan scenario, because ultimately, they think if their troops are infused with the adequate fighting spirit, and by the way, I think that's been quite lacking in the Russian forces in Ukraine, and some would say the human factor has prevailed, and so that sort of reinforces the Chinese ethic that it's not about technology, it's not even about numbers, it's about the will to fight and die. Thanks.
Good morning, gentlemen. I had a question, kind of a two-part question, in the scenario that China does invade Taiwan and the United States is pulled into a larger conflict directly with China, how would this affect some of the disputed island chains in Japan, the Kuril Islands with Russia? How would this affect South Korea and North Korean relations or conflict on the border? And how would this affect India on their border? Would they strengthen security, or would they worry about their own things?
You want to talk about the Kurils? Do you think that if there was a Taiwan invasion, that the Russians would conduct any kind of activity with the Kuril Islands, the disputed islands with Japan? So, if China invaded Taiwan, do you think that Russia would try to intervene in the Kuril Islands, the disputed islands with Japan?
Well, I think that I'm the wrong guy to answer the question. All I can say is that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin has initiated all sorts of contacts with all sorts of pariah states, including Iran and North Korea. And as you and I know, recently North Korean leader visited Russia on his super expensive armored train. And this was not just a demonstration of rehabilitation of political contexts and economical contexts. Of course, mainly this is all militarily. And I don't know what's happening, of course, because I just don't have access to all this information behind the closed doors, but I have no doubt that something's going on, and I'm sure that Southern Korea and Japan should be monitoring closely.
General Chun, do you think, do you worry about a Taiwan invasion and then what North Korea might do?
Yeah, we Koreans are really scared. Let me be very frank. We don't want to get into a war, but we have a mutual defense treaty with the United States, and we honor that treaty for the past 70 years. During Vietnam, we rotated 500,000 of our soldiers to Vietnam for 7.5 years. During Iraq, we were the third largest contingent sent to Iraq. In Afghanistan, we were there. So, and if something happens right next door to us, of course, we would be sucked into the war. Which again, I laid the question to you, should you fight there? And if you must, how should you fight? That's the real question.
Lyle, the other islands in Japan, perhaps the Senkakus, are they vulnerable if there's a Taiwan invasion?
Yeah, look, there is a lot of discussion in China now about what's going on these islands, because you see quite a robust Japanese and American buildup around little islands like Ishigaki, which are pretty close to Taiwan. My view is that China, in the opening phase, will do everything they can to sort of deter the United States and Japan and not bring them right in. So I don't think they would be hit right off the bat. But if it came to war, of course, they would come under full attack from the PLA, no doubt about it. Okinawa, in particular, I think would be hit extremely hard. In fact, there's some recognition by the Air Force of that, because they actually ended up pulling out a few squadrons because they realized that they would probably lose those squadrons right away. Just one last comment on the Russian angle. I do fear that the Russians may consider probably not getting involved directly, but make a demonstration during such a Taiwan scenario in order to kind of keep the Japanese off their guard, unhinge them, as it were. Korea, I do believe the Chinese would do everything they could to keep South Korea neutral. They're concerned about it. They're very concerned about the U.S. getting involved on Jeju Island, which is a new naval base that is quite proximate to Taiwan. So this is an interesting question. Unfortunately, I think China, maybe working together with North Korea, would have, be able to threaten South Korea with grave retaliation if South Korea got directly involved. But it is a very important question and on everybody's mind in Northeast Asia right now.
Question here.
Good morning, gentlemen. In the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, what do you believe the global response would be? Would it be fast and immediate conflict, or would there be deliberation on what to do?
Go ahead, Lyle, if you want to take that.
All right. Yeah, I could see everybody's focused on Taiwan, and for good reason. In my view, Taiwan is truly the most dangerous spot in the world today. Even more dangerous, I don't know if general permit, more dangerous than the situation on the peninsula, and more dangerous even than the Ukraine war, which is in itself shows a very troubling dynamic. But to put it simply, I think that the cost of such a war and its extraordinary violence, probably from the outset, my view is there would not be a kind of lot of warning, that it would be a very sudden kind of operation, because the Chinese know that has the best chance of success. A lot of deception. I believe the general was completely accurate in his portrayal of China's mindset, and I think in some ways that is a cultural difference. But I guess my simple answer to your question is I think it would look a lot like what we've seen in Ukraine. That would be a lot of concern about escalation, right? China is a nuclear power. It's building up its nuclear forces very robustly. It today has the forces to destroy the United States. So that should give us, I think, a bit of pause. So I think it probably would be a slow and deliberative process. There was recently an article in Foreign Affairs that talked about how the West has reacted to Ukraine, and it kind of said, like, actually, we needed this slow and deliberative process because, I know that's very controversial, but because of the escalation dynamic, which is there. So anyway, I think that would occur. I think there would be vast economic sanctions. The global economy would be shattered, at least for several years. But I don't think that it would descend into World War III right away. Anyway, it would unfold over a period of weeks.
Well, it's easy to know when it's 9:50 because people, I guess, have to get up and go to class. So I think we're at our break time here. Unless somebody wants us to continue, I'd be happy to do that. But I think we're at our time here. Let me just close with one quick anecdote. Unrestricted warfare was mentioned. In 2004, when I was at the National War College, the Chinese Minister of Defense came. And so I asked him in the Q&A, and I mentioned that that's a very prescient book, predicted a lot. And I asked him if China was using that book to inform its concept development and its doctrine. And he walked off to the side of the stage and consulted with his handlers. And then he walked back and looked me right in the eye and he said, "That book has been debunked, and don't believe everything you read." And I felt like he doth protest too much. And perhaps it confirmed for me and us that that is an important book to China. And I say that because I think it's important to more than just China. I think others are learning from that, and it is a book that needs to be studied along with all the others. So I'd like to thank our three great panelists here. That's an incredible amount of information that we learned in a very short time, and it gives us a lot of food for thought. And so please give a round of applause to these three great gentlemen. Thank you, and we'll get to the next panel.
So it'll be right forward, left back, that simple. Yeah, I tend to get dry, so Heather's going to give me some water. When I'm dealing with the Q's and A's, am I going to be there? No, you'll be sitting back down. Well, I guess I can carry it. I'll put it over here. All right. All right. Have a seat. Go ahead and get started. All right, it's about time to get started. So, there we go. My name is Dr. David Albrecht, and I am the Associate Dean for the online programs in Arts and Sciences, and I also direct the online Masters in History, Military History, and Museum Administration programs. Welcome to the 2023 Military Writers Symposium. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to the winner of the 2023 Colby Book Prize. Charles Stanley Jr. is the son of one of the 18 lost airmen who walked across the Yugoslav wilderness to safety in January of 1945. That was one of the coldest, worst winters in European history. Now retired, Stanley has held several positions in New York State government. Most notably, he coordinated the state's response to 9/11 attack as an aide to General George Pataki. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Charles Stanley.
I'm going to take the liberty of supplementing my biography, which I wrote myself. It's been my honor to hang out with my fellow panelists and speakers, and I must remark how distinguished and impressive they are, and many of them were operatives. And many of them were, if you'll pardon the expression, the most badass of all the badasses. But as part of my biography, I have to tell you that I was their worst nightmare in my time. Little white-haired me was their worst nightmare in two lives. First, I was a bean counter. And the bean counters are feared, very feared, and for the right reasons. Nothing happens without money. And then in my second life, I was a policymaker, even worse, even more feared. And so the piece of advice I want to pass on to the prospective military and civilian people is make friends. Make friends with your bean counters and make friends with your policymakers, because they can hurt you. They can hurt you a lot. I'm told it's tradition to read a segment of the book, so I will do that. I'm I'm very happy that I was selected to speak on the second day rather than the first, because it gave me a little bit of perspective on how to address you today and what perhaps section of the book could be most relevant. So I picked one that I think will be self-explanatory. Oh, shouldn't have done that. There we go. Official Air Force policy held that the stress of combat would affect the bravest men, and nowadays women, but then it was men. Courage was like money. Airmen spent some of it each mission, and no man had an unlimited supply. AAF psychologists identified 3 stages of fear. At first, the danger of aerial combat seemed remote. Reality set in during the second stage. By the third, airmen understood they were fugitives from the law of averages. Sooner or later, their luck would run out. At this stage, the tension became next to unbearable. In battle, every soldier has his own motivations for standing and fighting when his instinct for self-preservation tells him to run away. Some do it for pride, some out of duty, and some believe in the righteousness of their cause. Others fear shame or punishment. Studies show repeatedly, however, that men stand and fight mostly because of the camaraderie they share with their fellow soldiers. They risk death to avoid letting down their comrades. They find courage in the company of their brothers in arms. The pull of brotherhood was just as strong in the air as it was on the ground, perhaps more so. Bomber crews had trained together stateside, shared a long sea voyage or airplane flight overseas, and bunked together. Officers with officers, enlisted men with enlisted men. Their shared experiences often alchemized into deep bonds that extended long past the war. Most of all, a bomber crew was a team. The survival of all might depend on the actions of any single member. Morale depended upon every airman's confidence in his crewmates. For this reason, the AAF wanted crews to begin and end their tours of duty together. And that's sort of a little foreshadowing of a disaster that comes later in the chapter. How should we proceed? With the slides? Well, I also want to add one little thing since I have the podium. One of the little things that surprised me as I sat through some of the discussions was how interested many of you are in the process of writing. And I thought you would be more interested in sort of the military side of things, but there's been a lot of discussion about the process of writing. And I agree with everything that my fellow writers said about making the book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, all about the story and all about the characters. But I'll add one thing, and I think this speaks to both book writing and bureaucratic writing, which is really important to anybody who wants to get anywhere in any bureaucracy. And that is that to be successful, you really need to keep the reader in mind. You need to serve the reader. You need to understand what the reader needs and wants and give it to him. The reader is your client, and you need to serve him or her. And that is the key to good communication and good writing. All right. Now the book is about U.S. airmen who bail out over Yugoslavia during World War II and become stranded behind enemy lines. How do I do this? Where do I point? It's not my fault. There we go. So the book it's about the Airmen. It's about how they got there, how they got out, the context. But most of all, it's about the experience. By the time you finish the book, you should have gotten a sense of what it was like to be an airman during World War II and to have been shot down and to, if you were lucky, to have survived. One of the little tricks I employ while writing the book is that it's written as though it was written during the time. There aren't any modern expressions in there. The language, the metaphors, the movie stars that I say somebody looks like Robert Taylor. Probably none of you know who Robert Taylor was unless you're of a certain age. But I do that for a reason. You can look up who Robert Taylor was. But the airmen of the time didn't know they might look like George Clooney or somebody like that. They lived in their times, and I wanted the reader to live in those times with them. And that's part of the context. So just a little trick. I interviewed 40 of the airmen, including my father, who's one of them. They became my friends. As they all departed this vale, it was one of the tougher things I dealt with. Some of them I was too late to find. I was fortunate to discover that many of them had been interviewed by others, and I employed those sources. So there's a lot of original research in here. I use secondary sources to make sure that I've covered the sort of theoretical side of things. But mostly it's original research and much of it from the Air Force Archives and the National Archives. Another sort of tactic I employ is that I weave theoretical context into the practical context of what's happening. So in other words, there are 13 crews that I write about, and as serving the reader, I know better than to try to throw 130 characters at the reader, because there's no way that you as a reader would be able to keep track of everybody. This isn't War and Peace. So what you do is you select certain members of each crew and focus on them, and meanwhile I sometimes sneak in and sometimes not so subtly stop and say, okay, this is what this chapter is going to be about. This is about the stress of combat, or about the draft, or about any of these several themes. So I start with my father, not just because he was my father, but because I knew a lot about his training and selection. I think that would be a part of the book that would interest a lot of the young people here. These men were at the time the best of the best. They were tested, they were trained, and they were the best of their time physically and mentally. I get into their backgrounds because that tells who they are. That's how you flesh out the characters, and their ethnicity was an important part of them. One of the interesting things that I found in my research is that each crew of 10 men, with one exception, had a foreign speaker in it, because they were the sons of immigrants. And not only did they have another language, but they had a language that was useful in nowhere Yugoslavia, because they were right next to Italy. So if you were the son of an Italian immigrant, it was useful. I have a Czech, I have a Slovak, I've got a Ukrainian, I've got a Russian, I've got a Pole, and their languages were useful. And so remarkably, language was not all that much of a barrier, even though the men bailed out into the countryside of Yugoslavia. I talk about the strategy behind the missions, why they were up there, what their purpose was, and I spoke of the unique character of the air war. When, and I don't think there's ever been anything like it, and I don't think there's ever been anything since. When the guys were over the target, and this was after fighters were the main threat, they just had to sit there and take it. They were going 170 miles an hour over often an oil target, sometimes a transportation target. And they just had to sit there and take it. If you've watched 12 O'Clock High or something like that, they just droned through. There was no evasive action. Flak is bursting all about them. And either one of those pieces of flak had your name on it or it didn't. And there was nothing you could do about it. Absolutely nothing but pray. Talk about the military context. We'll get into that later. And maybe the most relevant thing here is the internecine warfare between two different factions in Yugoslavia at the time, the partisans and the Chetniks. And of course, these airmen were rescued by the partisans, and which is part of irregular warfare. And I think it's fair to say, and we could discuss this over a beer sometime, I think it's probably the most successful force multiplier operation in history. Basically, eventually the British supplied the partisans to, and eventually the Americans provided the treasure that forced Germany to keep 600,000 men in Yugoslavia when they didn't want to, and that helped immeasurably on the Eastern Front with the Russians and in Normandy and southern France. So. And that was done with basically 200 agents that the British had in the country, and roughly the same with the Americans. Imagine that. You've nailed down 600,000 of the enemy with 400 guys. That's pretty good. And there are the British secret agents. We can talk about them. And eventually, things kind of go bad with the partisans and with the townspeople, and we'll talk about that. More sub-themes. One of the themes that I have in here is that prejudice in the armed forces was maybe greater than people think these days, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism. I've got a lot of Jewish flyers in the book, and the extent of anti-Semitism in the Army Air Forces, which we know was segregated, but I didn't understand until I researched this how prevalent prejudice was, and even about the recent immigrants. When you look at the names in the book and you look at the names of the pilots, they're all mostly Anglo-Saxon, or the best you can get is Irish, and there's one Italian, and that's it. If you were Polish, chances are you weren't going to be a pilot, because the Air Force's idea at the time was that officers and gentlemen were Anglo-Saxons, and there are a number of factors that go in that. I don't want to forget the impact of the guys going missing on the home front. I wanted to make sure I covered that aspect of the war too. The war impacted people at home, and my mother liked to tell me that remind me that this is her story too, because she met my father in training. She was the girl he left behind. The parents got those horrible missing in action telegrams. If you became missing, somebody showed up at your parents' door, your wife's door, and with a telegram. And your heart skipped a beat, because nobody sent telegrams unless it was bad news. So your loved one was either dead or missing. And the best you could hope for when you saw the telegram was that, gee, I hope he's just missing. I also talk about the people who get on the ground and are captured rather than are rescued by the partisans. And that's a story in itself. So I cover all the bases, and so that by the time you're done, you'll have a pretty good idea of what did happen and could happen to any airman who flew out of Italy at the time. There's the guy that I started with. I started by researching his story, and that sort of evolved over time into researching the book. I realized as I researched his story that there was there's a pretty good story here, and I had some pretty good characters, so all of a sudden I had a pretty good book. This is my father's first airplane that he was shot down in, V for Victor, always known as the fertile turtle. I included this slide just so that you know that not all of World War II was fought in black and white. I'm a firm believer that much of history is really geography. And the two circles represent the ranges of the 8th Air Force, the more famous 8th Air Force flying out of England, and the range of the 15th flying out of Italy. And you'll see from the lower circle that there was a great deal of the Third Reich that couldn't be reached by the 8th, and that's why the 15th was there. So this illustrates, I think, to a great extent, why the 15th was an operation. And keep in mind that Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, had placed most of the oil refineries in the Reich outside of the range of the 8th, wisely until Italy surrendered and that we could place bombers in Italy. And that was the primary mission of the guys who were shot down, was to attack oil targets. This explains again why the airmen that I write about ended up where they were. And basically ground zero, as you can see, is kind of the nexus of their flight patterns. And they ended up in that territory because it was on the way back from their oil targets in Germany. So 84 airmen become stranded in this town. This is a postcard from the time. Several of the airmen had them. So they had postcards back then, even in nowhere Yugoslavia, modern-day Bosnia. They become stranded there because the Germans are mostly retreating. They're trying to get out of Greece so that they can reinforce their comrades on the Eastern or Western Front, and they don't want to become isolated and trapped in the Balkans. So the Germans are everywhere, and the partisans only hold X amount of the country. And this was one of the few safe spots, and the only spot in the region that had flat enough territory that a C-47 could land. The topography we'll see later on is it's rugged. It's more rugged than here. It's more rugged than the high peaks of the Adirondacks. It's the Dinaric Alps. It's tough territory. So what happens is that the reason the town is there is because it's on the river, and the river had flooded, as it did every fall, and the airstrip was flooded. So the airmen had to wait for an airborne evacuation until it got cold enough for the soggy ground to freeze. I talk about the secondary. There are actually, when you count them, there were 5 wars going on at once in Yugoslavia at the time. Yugoslavia was the 3rd most dangerous place on earth to live during World War II. The Russians and the Poles suffered more per capita casualties, but Yugoslavia is 3rd. 1 million people out of 19 million people before the war died, and a great many of them were killed in this sort of internecine warfare. But we can talk about why the British eventually switched their support from the royalist Chetniks to communists. Here's the most ardent anti-communist of the 20th century decides he's going to shift his focus on resistance to the Germans from a king who was in exile in London to communists. And the idea was basically that they would kill more Germans than the Chetniks would. And it was that simple. And he was going to leave it till the end of the war to figure out, to pick up the pieces. So, 84 airmen is a lot of airmen. They sort of trickle in, and it causes problems. The airmen are not briefed on how to behave when they get on the ground. I'm sure the things are much more elaborate now. There's a class of cultures, but most importantly, each American has 48 gold-backed dollars in their escape kits. And I did a little math. I figured out how many kuna had been printed by the Croatian government, their unit their monetary unit. And when you add up just the escape kits, that the value of the money in the escape kits that the airmen had, in this one little town, 84 airmen had the equivalent of 1/10 of the Croatian economy in their little backpacks. To give you an idea of how ridiculously wealthy they are, they drop into a communist-held town. Communists believe in equality, and they're conspicuously rich, and things do not go well. Eventually, the last crew that comes into town includes this man, who is a flight surgeon named Captain James Johnson. And this is a picture that he had one of his crewmates take while he's in the airplane waiting to take off on the day that he was shot down. He's a captain. He's finagling to get flight pay. He flies once a month so that he can increase his pay by 50% so that he can get flight pay. And when he gets shot down and ends up in town, he's the only captain in town. So he's the ranking officer among all these 13 aircraft commanders, experienced leaders of men. The flight surgeon all of a sudden becomes the senior officer in town. And things do not go well there either. Finally, after waiting about a month, these are not actual photos. These are like examples of what might have happened. But a C-47 arrives. It unloads a Jeep for the British agents, a present for them, and they load up 66 of the airmen. And as I said, there were 84 airmen in town, so 18 of them are forced to stay behind. And there's a dramatic scene in the book where the 18 they're left standing there, and they're saying to the commander of the transports, "Hey, there's room for us, we can go." And the commander of the aircraft says, "No, you can't. I have a limit of 22 per plane." And what he had forgotten, I think, is that what his 22-man limit was based on paratroopers who each carried 80 pounds of weight when they were dropped. So there was plenty of room on the planes, and there was plenty of capacity to carry them all out. But he followed the rules and left 18 behind. My father volunteers to stay behind when they promise that they'll be back the next day. And of course, they weren't back the next day. And again, disaster ensues. So this is a photograph I took while I was in Bosnia. This gives you just a little sample of what the terrain is like for the 120 miles that my father and 17 other airmen had to traverse in the middle of what we know is the worst winter of the 20th century. This is the winter of the Battle of the Bulge. historically bad weather. The snow was so deep as they were trying to escape that they were basically, it was 6 feet deep, and they were basically swimming through the snow. And they had about 10 partisan escorts, and basically they took turns on point plowing through the snow. And all the airmen spoke incredibly highly of the partisans and their ruggedness and their stamina. And we've got several football players among the Americans, and not even the hardiest of the football players could keep up with the smallest of the partisans. This is the route they took for, I like this map, first of all, because it's from a map that was included in the escape kits, but it also gives a sense of the terrain and the altitude. The darker the print, the higher the altitude. So our heroes at last get to Split, which is a port on the Dalmatian coast. Somewhere along the way, they had been in a cabin on a mountainside when the worst of the blizzard hit. They were stuck there for 3 days. They run out of food. For a while, the horse that had carried some of their goods is neighing outside, protesting against the blizzard. And eventually, the airmen realized, wait a second, we don't hear that horse anymore. And pretty soon, one of the partisans brings in a pot of stew that they hadn't witnessed before. And so they know what's in there, but what are you going to do? It's eat it or starve. And so they ate it. So our heroes reach the coast, and this is, again, a postcard that some of the guys brought back. But wait, there's more, because we still have to deal with the other guys who are missing. And some of them return. They hadn't been away long enough, and they return to combat. So there's members of the blank crew who ended up with the Chetniks, the other faction in Yugoslavia. We have to deal with the POWs, which is an experience in itself. And some of them go back into combat, and 3 of them are killed in action. So they go through this entire strenuous exercise. Mulvaney was with my father. He was missing 40 days, a biblical 40 days. He returns. The quota for having been missing so you could go home was 42 days. So he just missed it by 2 days. He goes back into combat and is killed. And I think one of the more interesting parts of the book is about the blank crew, the 4 guys who ended up with Mihailovich, the leader of the Chetniks, and he and 21 others are the last Americans to see Mihailovich, and they witnessed the destruction, the final destruction of the Chetnik army at the hands of the partisans, and so they are sort of the only outside witnesses to history. So that's pretty cool stuff. And then there's the POWs, and on the right is Eugene Quinn, who I had the pleasure of interviewing, and on the left is Colonel Zemke, who was the senior POW commander in Stalag Luft 1, and he's a remarkable figure in history. When the Russians were approaching and about to liberate the camp, most of the camps were evacuated by the Germans at gunpoint, and they had what they called the Black March, which was something of a death march because there was no food. And most of the American prisoners had to travel a good 600 miles on foot without any supplies given by the Germans. Zemke stood his ground and simply refused to go. And he went to the commandant and he said, I'm going to hold you accountable. If any of my guys are killed because you're trying to force us to move, we're going to hold you accountable. The commandant relented, and his Stalag was spared the ordeal that every other air POW anyway in Germany had to face. And then we have our happy ending. My father returns home. He had carried his parachute all the way across Yugoslavia. He says that when he was shot down the first time, my mother chided him for not bringing back her parachute because it was in vogue at the time to turn parachutes into wedding dresses for the brides. And so he said, well, okay, I'll carry it across. He carried it the whole 120 miles. The seamstress, when she was making the parachute, or the wedding dress, had to cut away all the mud stains from Yugoslavia, but somehow managed it and made the wedding dress. So that's the storybook ending to the book.
Thank you very much. So if you come join me over here. I'd like to open the floor for some questions, and to prime the pump, I will follow what many of the other moderators have done and start with this question. We are at a conference on special operations, so can you talk a little bit, Charles, about what sort of special operations activities that the American OSS and the British SOE did to assist your father and his comrades?
Well, as the Allies kind of split their spheres of influence at the beginning of the war, Yugoslavia and Greece and the rest of the Balkans were considered to be basically a British sphere of influence. But so they sent, as I said, I think about 200 agents scattered all around Yugoslavia, many in Slovenia, to gather intelligence, to assist in any way they could the partisans, and also to gather the stray airmen who showed up. As time went on, Americans became the dominant partner of the Western Allies, and they had the money, they had the troops. By then, the British were pretty much exhausted from. Remember, when America entered the war, the British had been at war for 2 years and had been carrying the load by themselves. So by 1944, many of their young men were already in service or killed or whatever, and the Americans had become the dominant force in the Western Allies. And so the Americans started to sort of stick their nose into Yugoslavia and had very different ideas about what to do with the country. So when you got on the ground, if you were British, the partisans sort of looked at you askance because they knew that the British wanted influence. They wanted not control, but at least they wanted them in their sphere of influence. The Americans didn't want anything. The partisans knew that the Americans were willing to give without getting anything, which I think gets back to the point that the general made last night and before, that it was generosity, rather than just pure generosity, rather than transactional aid, that actually gave the Americans more influence than the British had in the long run. And I think that's a good lesson. I think it accents what the general said last night. But yeah, we didn't use the term force multipliers at the time, but the British aid and then the much greater American aid were really what allowed the partisans to keep those 600,000 men away from other fronts.
President Anarumo.
Thank you, David. And sir, thanks for being here, first of all, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you.
It's quite an honor, and we're very proud to have you here.
My honor.
So the last slide talked about difficulties of reintegration from those that you covered in the book. Can you talk more about what was the core? Was there a common theme about the difficulty of reintegration? Was it about captivity, about the trauma of warfare? What was the common theme of the difficulty of the returnees?
I think that's a great question because I think the perception is that, particularly after the Vietnam War, when veterans came home and many of them were greeted with scorn as they came back, and I think they contrasted it in their minds to the return that their forefathers had received when they got back from World War II. But I think that was sort of a false impression. The people who came back from World War II were not often greeted with parades. They were welcome, but there were so many of them. Remember, there's 40 million of them, in a population of like maybe 160 million in the country, and they were everywhere, and so they were so ubiquitous. They went almost unnoticed. So they were kind of alone. Like I use the metaphor of like trees in a forest. They were sort of unnoticed, and yes, they were appreciated. They had to transition to civilian life. Most of them were draftees. If they weren't draftees, in the Air Corps, they were volunteers, but many of them were volunteers because they would have been drafted otherwise, and they decided they'd rather be in the air than on the ground. So they didn't really have a lot of choice in the matter. They had left their homes, they had left their jobs, and life had gone on without them. And they were gone for 3 or 4 years, came back and had to transition back into civilian life. And it wasn't easy. Plus, people didn't understand the post-traumatic, stress syndrome like they do today, and there wasn't the help available. And plus, the ethic of the time was to sort of suck it up and not talk about it. And although official, I have the official sort of release documents that the Air Force gave. They encouraged them to talk about it, but practically nobody did. And in fact, with many of the airmen who I interviewed, 40 years later, the family would come to me and say, this is the first time he talked about this. These guys are 65 years old, and they hadn't talked about it at all. And part of my job as a researcher was to establish my credibility so that these guys would talk to me. I had to sort of prove my worth, tell them, let them understand that I knew what I was talking about, that I had talked to others like them, and I got it. And that's part of an interviewing technique if you're ever in that situation.
Dr. Morris.
Congratulations also on the award. Well done.
Thank you.
And also thank you for telling this important story. I was struck with your comment about flak and them just taking it. And I was thinking about something similar, but from an infantryman's perspective, that even in artillery barrage, you can still seek cover, potentially.
Right.
But just thinking of these bomber crews, time and time again, just sitting there, hoping that they're not going to be struck, it's really profound, actually. So can you speak a little bit about what the crews and the airmen did, maybe psychologically, to endure that, and the resilience that it took, and not just by these crews, but thousands upon thousands of airmen did this time and time again. And I think, to your point, it's really unique for warfare. So if you could unpack that a little bit, it would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. And I do talk about that in the book, the fact that at the time, and I think that's been discussed yesterday too, that at the time, and I think even now, infantrymen look up in the sky and they see the airmen flying by and say, those glory boys. And and it's true. The airmen worked 8-10-hour days. They got up in the morning. They had a hot meal. If they weren't shot down, they returned to a hot meal and warm barracks or tents. And to an infantryman, I can see where you'd say, I'm in a mud hole. I haven't had hot food in a month, and those guys are the glory boys. Well, that's true, but the infantrymen had the ground, and the airmen didn't. No matter what happened to you, you could hug the ground. The airmen had, I think, a unique sense of danger. You're suspended in the air. The threat is three-dimensional. Things are blowing up all around you. Not only that, you have an unfortunate clear field of vision. You can see that everywhere around you for 5 miles, there's flak. And once you get out of that, you're probably okay. But for those 5-6 minutes, you're in it. You are in danger, and there's no getting out of it. So yes, and I do talk about it as a unique aspect of warfare. I don't think it's ever happened before, and I hope it never happens again. But yes, the stress became too much for some of them, and I talk a good deal about that. One of the main job of a flight surgeon, although none of them, or few of them anyway, were trained as psychologists, was to determine if a flyer was fit to fly and determine whether they'd had enough, and then send them home. So Captain Johnson there was a pediatrician, and yet he's making the decision on the base of who's going to fly and who isn't. Even the unit command, even the wing commander, couldn't allow an airman to stay out of the air. It was only the flight surgeon in the whole group was the one who could determine that an airman had had enough. And I mentioned in what I read that that near the end of their missions. And I think we're used to hearing that the 8th Air Force had a quota of 25 missions because that's what happened to the Memphis Belle. In Italy, it was 35. And by the time you got to the end of 35, it's like, I'm almost there. And by the time of your last mission, you just, the suspense was unbearable. And in fact, what happens in one crew is that a guy on his 35th mission panics and bails out without orders when the plane gets in trouble, and the other guys don't hear an alarm to bail out. There's no order from the captain to bail out, but the others follow him because panic is contagious. So it's that's again one of the more important things I think that the book conveys.
Time for one more question.
Hi. So I have an author question for you. So I'm curious, every author thinks about that next book as they're writing, and I'm curious if any of the stories that you collected stood out to you for your next book.
I have stories that didn't make it into the book. The book is 100,000 words. When I first wrote it, just to get it all down, it was 200,000 words. So, and there are, I said there are 13 crews. There's one crew that I don't deal with at all because, or hardly, they're mentioned, but not much, because there wasn't room for them, and nothing that happened to them didn't happen to somebody else. So what I've done is I've taken some of the stuff that I cut out and I put it on my website as kind of bonus content. So, and I think there might be an article or two somewhere to publish. But no, my next book will be on about 9/11. It'll be about I was lucky enough to be part of the team that commanded the response to 9/11, and so I was there. I have all the material that is available from the state's records. I know everybody who participated in the response, and I think I'm in a unique position, again, to write this book. So I know stuff that nobody else knows, and I have material that nobody else has. So I feel duty-bound to make that my next book.
All right, before we adjourn, I believe that you have a show and tell item.
I do. You know, you're never too old for show and tell. So what you learned there's some book out there somewhere that says everything you need to know you learn in kindergarten. But I thought people might enjoy this. This is the parachute wedding dress. That this material was carried across Yugoslavia. And my mother was married. You can see the cutaways. They had to build it this way, and seams all over the place because they cut away the mud. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Sure.
certain number. It's not a percentage, it's just the total number that you can ultimately get to a point that they can actually go to fight. And there are women who want to go and fight, and there are women of character who are willing to sacrifice their lives for this country and can do so honorably and at the standard that's expected of them. And I think that that's an important delineation that has to be made here. Even though this discussion is supposed to be about CSTs and OEF and OIF, what we're really talking about specific to this question is there a specific value to a woman in combat? And I would argue no. The value comes from the fact that that's a person who is willing to fight and die for their country. And if enough of them want to do that, that's just more people that are willing to do what it takes to win a war. So fundamentally, like, Allison made some really great points about why people like her were so valuable in an operation that is kind of characterized by stability to an extent to enable other offensive operations or intelligence operations, whereas this question specifically alludes to today and combat. And I think that's kind of an important delineation in this conversation overall.
Thank you. The next question we have for the panelists is, when did the realization hit for commanders that the status of being a woman during Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom was a benefit in gaining intel? Was this a rapid transition, or did it come with hesitation?
I really can't speak to the when and why and how. I think that there probably was a hesitation. When we were chosen for our rotation, some of the Special Forces teams were not open to what we could bring to the table. Nonetheless, some of my counterparts were chosen to go with those teams, and they were not received well, they were not used well, they were the whole gambit, cook for us and we'll take you on a mission, that kind of horrible stuff. I was lucky enough to be with a team that was very mature, understood the capability, and wanted it. So I think at that time, at least, it was dependent on the team. The folks that went in the first rotation for cultural support teams were essentially voluntold to go. So they might have been the quote unquote problem child the commander didn't want to deal with and said, you're going to go downrange with Special Forces whether you like it or not. Some folks volunteered a little bit, and then it kind of got better as time went on. So I know that there was a need. We met the need eventually. There was definitely hesitation, and we probably could have been used, at least in that capacity, from when we started in the Middle East up in Gulf War. So.
I've had the pleasure, so again, while I have not served in that capacity, so I definitely don't want to speak in that capacity, because Allison definitely was on the ground and experienced it, and I think there's so much value and respect that comes with that. I, from an academic perspective, have done some research to understand, when female engagement teams came about. I've had the honor to publish with Dr. Johnson-Fries on articles, and so I'm a little bit more familiar with the timeline. And in our conversations, Pulumi and I, he said something that really resonated with him in our discussions, is what I'm going to share with you all. I think, and this contributed to Commander's decision to kind of advocate for the need for female engagement teams and cultural support teams. It was the sheer fact that the majority, all, of the special operators were men. It was their gender, the fact that they were men, that prevented them access to a key node of intelligence in OIF and OEF. A lot of people associate gender with women. That's conflating sex and gender. Sex is how you are biologically born. Gender is male, female. And because of that, as it relates to mission, you can be excluded from something because you are a female or included, and the same goes for men. And as we're speaking here, or what we're speaking about here today, it was the men who were excluded and who did not have access to a key node of information just for the sheer fact that they were men. And once they realized that, and once they realized how that was impacting their ability to complete the mission, is when they advocated and promoted for, hey, we really do need cultural support teams and female engagement teams. The idea really resonated in around 2009. Once they started training up more Afghan forces who they felt could do the job, it kind of was disbanded in 2012. And then they realized the need for it, so the program stood up again in 2015.
The article that Tahina references that we wrote was on the need to integrate women, peace, and security into professional military education. And the reason we felt it imperative to write and publish that article is so that there was a ground-up understanding of the role of gender equality in national security affairs, again, internally and externally, so that Allison didn't have to worry about was the person or was the team she was assigned to going to accept or not accept them. So that Tahina, as a gender advisor, didn't have to educate every single commander that you worked with or for as to the value. That it inherently would be part of the analysis and assessments and considerations that were part of operations. And to just kind of boil down the women, peace, and security framework that has pillars, everything has pillars, into two parts. It's inclusive diversity, so there is that diversity part. The second is what's called gendered perspectives. This idea that we're not talking about just women, we're talking about how policies and programs affect men, women, boys, and girls differently. Just a very simple example of that, I'll give you two. One is more women than men are seriously injured or die in car crashes than men. Why are more women more seriously injured or died than men? It's not because we're worse drivers. It's because the crash dummies upon which safety standards are built around a 6-foot-tall, 200-pound male body type. Doesn't work for a 100-pound, 5'2" woman. At the national or international level, the Food and Agriculture Organization says that if we would distribute food aid that is given internationally differently to the women who work the fields rather than the men who own the fields, we could increase food production to the extent that there would be 100 to 150 fewer hungry people globally. So it's this idea of working in gendered perspectives into considerations of assessments and, again, analysis increases the potential for your strategy to be effective.
Our third question, the U.S. permitted women to serve in combat roles beginning in 2013. What factors enable women to be a pioneer in their field of women in combat?
I can give you background. Air Force General Wilma Vaught basically said things in the military change by policy and lawsuits. And there were two lawsuits that were initiated, one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast, that were going to challenge the women being excluded from ground combat that perhaps motivated the Pentagon to move before they actually got to court. But it was also in recognition, these lawsuits were being filed by women who had served in combat, but had done so through attachment rather than inclusion. They had to find workarounds. And consequently, in the case of one of the women who was ready to file the lawsuit, she had been shot down, a helicopter pilot, shot down, and after she went back into service, she wanted to be an air ground controller and was excluded because it was considered ground combat. She could be shot down but not serve in its other role, and she decided that the capabilities that she could bring to that role were such that, again, she was the right person for the job, but being excluded because of her sex. And that moved things along. Recognition of need. It goes back to exactly what's been said before, recognition of need.
Yeah, I think specifically what factors enabled, I mean, you're looking at a factor. Allison's work is the CSTs are really, I think, what set the stage for women to be able to be integrated into combat arms and to be in SOF units now, Special Operations Forces units now. It was the demonstration of their competence when they were on a patrol and their ability to hold their own and be accountable and maintain themselves and maintain their surroundings. I think that ultimately lends itself to the trust and confidence that they were able to earn from their peers and from their superiors and subordinates. And it's that combined with, I think, policy that ultimately allowed for women to be able to be integrated into combat. So I think this is a perfect point for maybe, if you want to talk about that, Allison, I think you're it.
Yeah, sounds good. So, yeah, stuff has just changed so much since 2000. I think back even when real anecdote here, from when I graduated Norwich, and the colonel who was in charge of Army ROTC at the time, when we went to commission, he said that all the women had to wear skirts. And if you chose to wear pants, you were going to get your first negative counseling statement in the Army. I mean, that's 2010. So how far we've come just in that time. And then back to 2011, I mean, the front line, the idea of front line was non-existent. I mean, we're fighting counterinsurgency. There was no front line like you had in World War II, and we were in combat. I mean, we were going to get closer to combat than we did as a cultural support team members. I think women in civil affairs, formerly PSYOPs, military police, they were doing it longer than cultural support team members. They were there. The CA girls or CA women were doing that type of mission, training up females, bringing them resources long before CSTs were even a factor. And I'm happy that I was part of that and part of that almost breaking the glass ceiling, if you will. But I do want to make sure people understand that there was civil affairs, PSYOPs, women who were doing that before us as well.
I also think it's important to say that women have been serving in combat well before we were allowed to serve in combat, or women were allowed to serve in combat. As far back as the Revolutionary War, Deborah Sampson, she was the first woman she had to disguise herself as a man, but she served and was the first woman to receive pension as a result of that. And so we've been serving for as far back as our country goes. I do think that, as Dr. Johnson-Freese mentioned, the threatening of being sued maybe propelled, kind of motivated the government to establish a law. And while sometimes it's unfortunate to think that it requires law and policy to be in place to kind of direct folks to do that, I have seen over the last 5-10 years that there's been more policy. In 2017, the Women, Peace and Security Act, which was followed by a 2019 Women, Peace and Security Strategy. In 2020, it was followed by an implementation plan directing the Department of Defense services to kind of let the Department of Defense know how they intend to actually implement it. And I'm very proud to say that the Department of the Air Force in 2023, so this past June, was the first service to publish their Women, Peace and Security implementation plan, of which I had the honor to be part of. And so I do think it comes hand in hand. Unfortunately, things take time, but I do think it's important to note that women have been serving in combat for as far back as our country goes.
Thank you. So this is our final question from the moderators. So if any students or faculty would like to line up in preparation after this question, feel free to. So our final question is, what do gender perspectives look like in warfare today across the globe? We know the United States is not the only country to use gender perspectives. What data points vary country to country?
Ending with a tough one, right? I spoke a little bit about like the numbers of how different countries are incorporating women in the percentages. I think if I could offer maybe a slight reframing of the question, which would be, how does gender matter in peace, which I hope is the ultimate goal of warfare, right? We're not just fighting to fight. We're fighting because we want to make sure that everyone, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, can live safe, can have food, have the right to pursue their dreams. And that is where gender comes into play. We can't fight wars without gender in mind if the ultimate goal is peace for everyone, regardless of gender.
I mentioned last night on the panel that other countries, including countries in the Middle East, Latin America, everywhere, are increasingly including women across the board in professions. I've worked with Pakistani fighter pilots, women Pakistani fighter pilots, Jordanian special forces, women special forces. There is a recognition, again, that there is a need for both workforce and capabilities, and this sometimes it's slow. Integration can be very slow. What we see also is as women become involved in the military, it can have spillover effects to the general population. It can have effects on things like the atrocities of domestic violence that are still suffered among many women in many countries of the world. I have, in a shameless promotion of my new book's coming out December 1st, Women, Peace, and Security, and on the cover, it's a depiction of an acid-throwing survivor from Uganda. Acid throwing is primarily against women. It is prevalent in some African countries and also in South Asia and Southeast Asia. The violence that is experienced by women in the home is called the first political order, and there's empirical linkage between what happens in the home and what happens at national and international level. So this general recognition of these linkages are making a real difference in across the globe in the role that women are playing, and it often starts in the military.
Thank you. We'll begin with asking questions from the audience, or taking questions from the audience. We'll start on the left side.
Really great panel. A couple of quick comments and a question. Well, I think, Israel is on a lot of our minds, and I know a lot of female Israeli soldiers have been on the front line. But I would just commend to people, 50 years ago was the Yom Kippur War, and Israel's wartime leader, Golda Meir, there's actually a movie about this, and really, I really commend it to everyone. If you're interested in national security leadership, you need to see this. Next to her is Moshe Dayan, the wartime hero. He completely falls apart. Mentally, he just cannot take the pressure. She stands in and gets the job done, and her actions led to the peace, then the victory, and then the peace with Egypt. One quick comment on China. I would say that China does, they appreciate the force multiplier. They have so many women in their armed forces, and I want to say, including in the special forces. And they've taken it to a new level, I think, where they've created many special female units, like elite female units. So that's an interesting approach. My question is about at the leadership level. There have been some real new achievements here. The leader of the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations, is Admiral Franchetti. We also have the leader of the Coast Guard is female too. So I just, maybe to Dr. Johnson-Fries, I'm a great admirer of your work. Maybe you could comment on the kind of this new level, the levels that women are now reaching in national security. What's your appraisal?
Well, I think it's great. First of all, I think it's great, and it's been a long time coming. But I also think we can't assume that because there is a woman in a leadership position that all is right within the organization as a whole. Very often as women, when they get to a higher level, can speak out more about gender issues and about inclusivity. But if they do it too much, then there can be rebuke from that. So I think one of the things that I argue is that in organizations, any organization, including the military, it's often kind of the middle managers that can be decisive in whether women feel accepted, are promoted. The three factors that men count on for hiring, retention, and promotion are competence, confidence, and mentorship. Those three factors are the same for women, but work entirely differently. And women find themselves having to navigate behaviors that in a man will be considered aggressive in a positive way can be similarly considered aggressive in a negative way for women. So women have to walk a very careful line, and I think this women's leadership, they are still walking a very careful line as leaders. And what a lot of research has found is that until an organization reaches a tipping point, a demographic tipping point of about 25 to 30%, women tend to be included, but not really have the voice that is needed to make the organization more inclusive.
Thank you. We'll take the next question on the right.
Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a computer science and information systems major here at Norwich. My question is this. NASA has considered sending an all-women team to Mars and beyond in future space missions because they require fewer resources and can use said resources more efficiently. Has the military ever considered doing something similar with a mission on the ground?
No. Unequivocally, no. And I'm not trying to be rude in that at all. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's actually extremely cool. I didn't even hear about that until you said that right now. But the military's mission, at least in combat particularly, we're talking about like a typical combat load for somebody who's going to go on patrol is anywhere between 80 to 120 pounds. So from like an efficiency perspective and like a mechanical perspective, a man is a better choice to be able to carry that load on average. He's generally 180 pounds, maybe between like 5'9" and 6 feet tall. So that load, percentage-wise, is significantly less of his body weight compared to like an average female. There have been all-female teams in the military, not just CSTs, but in other parts of the SOF community. Those are for very exquisite missions. And because they're so exquisite, relative to how much they cost, they often end up being divested of because there's so few use cases ultimately, because oftentimes, at least in the Army, and I can only speak for the Army, our job is to close with and destroy the enemy. So it really comes down to the best person for the job. So more often than not, the Army doesn't usually look for all female, they just look for who is going to do the job the best.
Thank you.
We'll take the next question on the left.
Good morning, ladies. Cadet Lim, thank you for inspiring us today. I really look up to every single one of you. This question is directed to Captain Burnham. Could you share your experience of being one of the first females to graduate Ranger School? And for anyone, if you have any advice for those females who are interested in joining special operations in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I will try not to be too long with this because that could definitely be a long story. I think we've kind of already touched on this numerous times, and in my experience that I had, there was a lot of fanfare about women going to Ranger School. I think there was an expectation that they were going to experience a lot of sexism. Like if you were a woman going through Ranger School, you're going to experience a lot of sexism. Everything would be significantly more difficult. I certainly kind of went into that with that mindset, just thinking that that's maybe how it would be. And it in fact was not. In no way was it that way. And I actually had a really good discussion with my friend about this yesterday. Ranger School was quite literally about, could you carry the weight? Could you walk the miles? Could you do what was expected of you and what your team needed you to do? And that was it. And there were 2 men in my squad that were my size, literally 5'3", maybe slightly heavier. So there was never an excuse of size. There was never an excuse of anything. Certainly I didn't offer any of those. But I think if you're interested in going to that school, or if you're interested in joining an elite unit, it's about what you're doing. And that purpose, that reason for being there is the only thing that anybody's really going to care about. You're going to find very few people who are the stereotype that maybe sometimes the media inflates, that are going to want to undermine you. There are not a lot of people like that. It's going to be based mostly on your performance and mostly on your ability to work with other people in that team environment.
Thank you so much.
This will be our final question on the right. We have the honor to have our panelists for the rest of the day, I believe so. So if you have any time, just stop them and ask your question. Otherwise, this will be our final question. Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thank you for coming. I just had a question mostly for Captain McDonald, but like you mentioned last night that you had to like come up with fake husband and fake kids to kind of like breach through and talk more to the locals. Did you have to make any other adaptations like that?
Not really, and I think specifically, this is great points from this panel, but my mission was so unique to Afghanistan just because of the culture. So had to concede a lot. I remember we were wearing, at the time we first were doing our missions, our plate carriers, and I remember females would feel me up. They would just automatically, like, are you really a woman? We don't want to talk to you. Are you a man? Because you look like a man. So having to just kind of take that American hat off and just ingrain yourself in this culture where, unfortunately, women, there's still female circumcision, right? There's women getting pushed in fires because they're females. So to take off that first world hat and just kind of let it happen was a challenge, but we kind of got through it. I think those are pretty much the two examples I gave last night, and I can repeat them too. So gave the example of culturally having to talk to these females who typically were being married off between the ages of 12 and 15, if not earlier, or having kids starting as early as they could, multiple kids. And then for me to come to Afghanistan with the woman I was deployed with, Jen, we both were, I was 22, she was, I think, maybe 27, 28. We didn't have kids at the time, we didn't have husbands at the time. And that was alarming to the Afghan women who were wondering what the heck was wrong with us, because physically, you're supposed to have kids at this time, and you don't have a husband, nobody likes you, what's wrong with you? So they would spend the first few missions we did, it was just focused on what's wrong with you guys? Can we help you? They were trying to give us marriage counseling advice on how to catch men. It was wild. And so eventually we realized that we're gonna have to start telling them that we have kids and that we're married. So my boyfriend at the time, I put a ring on my finger. I had family from home send me pictures of my little cousins at the time, and I'd say, these are my kids and this is my husband. And I remember getting the question of, how does your husband let you come here? How is that even allowed? And trying to navigate that too is another challenge. But specifically, it was just an interesting, unique experience all around.
Awesome. As we wrap up this very enlightening panel session, I think it's abundantly clear that incorporating gender perspectives has been an instrumental factor in the success of special operations. But there's still a lot more that can be done. Over the past 15 minutes, we've heard powerful stories, insights, and evidence that underscores the value of gender inclusion in the field. The experiences and expertise shared today remind us that embracing gender perspectives not only strengthens our forces, but also the nation's security. Let's give a well-deserved round of applause to our esteemed panelists. Sure.